Hello, you are on the Stories by the Fireplace channel. Make yourself comfortable. Enjoy listening to it. Mason took turns opening his travel bags and checking their contents, checking the notes in his old notebook. It was important not to forget the essentials, the things you couldn't do without on the road and at the Black Sea resort. An electric razor, canned food, bread, glasses, toothpaste, medicine, and much more. Tomorrow Mason and his grandson Max planned to take the express train south. They had never been to the seashore, so the upcoming trip was exciting for both travelers. The grandson, who was 10 years old, was especially jubilant. At that age, a person is excited about any event. What kind? Anything, as long as he doesn't go to school. The boy especially liked the fact that it was a warm summer. September 1 was still far away, and he was to meet the sea, which he knew only from books and movies. Max adored movies. Especially he liked films about dashing pirates furrowing the sea. In his heart he didn't mind enlisting in pirates himself, especially in the middle of the school year. The boy dreamt of the sea. Max dreamed of a fast pirate schooner under a black flag with a white skull and bones. She was rushing with all her sails on the endless Atlantic among the huge waves bubbling. The boy saw some sea battles, the boarding of merchant ships, chests full of gold, half rotten from time, banana islands with natives and parrots. The boy was happily telling his friends about his upcoming trip to the resort, making up and fantasizing a lot, boasting that he would soon be swimming in the sea until blue in the face from dawn till dusk. His friends listened with open ears and were quietly jealous. Some of them terrorized their parents into taking them to the sea too. Old Mason had worked as a tractor driver all his life. In the evenings, he would go out to smoke outside the hut and try to recall some bright episodes from his past life, but there were few funny ones. These moments could be easily counted on the fingers. There were more hardships and worries. Mason went to work early. He did not sit on his parents' shoulders. Times were hard back then. There was a perception that if you were born in the countryside, you had to drag your own coalcoes until you retired. It was especially difficult for those whose family was not well off. And in those days, almost everyone could hardly make ends meet. They didn't starve, of course, but they had to economize. Rarely one of his peers was lucky enough to go to the city to obtain the then prestigious profession of veterinarian or technician. But mostly rural boys were expected to pursue a career as cattlemen, machine operators, or tractor drivers. That was also the fate of Mason. After graduating from college, the boy went to work in the golden fields of the motherland, where he carried his burden with dignity without complaining about his fate. He made a pretty good living at the time. Rather, he always had enough money for food and clothes, and people at the time did not care much about their own material well-being. There was no such thing. After Mason retired, the man got completely bored. If it were not for his favorite fishing, he would not know what to do. His wife died of a stroke 10 years ago. He buried her and became quite sad. It was good that he had a grandson. With him, it was a different story. So the two of them would sit together with Max in the evening under the bright light of the desk lamp, doing homework together and solving arithmetic puzzles about pedestrians who left points A and B simultaneously, and about mysterious pools of water. It was fun for Mason, and it was more fun for the boy to chew on the granite of science too. After school, Grandpa and his grandson went into the kitchen to prepare dinner. They fried potatoes, bright yellow eggs with lard, made a salad of cucumbers and tomatoes, finally tea with bread and jam. Then Max would run outside to play with his buddies, and Grandpa would turn on the TV. Max's parents had died in a fire. Mason often looked at the picture with his son and daughter-in-law. It hung in a black mourning frame on the wall, filling his wrinkled eyes with moisture. He and his wife had no heirs of their own. They had adopted from an orphanage. They adopted the boy when he and his wife were about 40 years old, and it was clear that they would not have children of their own. Amanda, my wife, was very ill in her womanhood. The doctors decided that there was no point in treating this kind of infertility, and her age was considered critical. She was not a young woman after all. So gynecologists consulted and pronounced their verdict, which Amanda had to accept under the above-mentioned circumstances. The adoption of somebody else's child was a long-awaited joyous event. There was another stretch of time when life for a pensioner became even worse. Mason still had tragic memories from 5 years ago. He was glad to forget them, but they were still there. On that fateful day, his son and daughter-in-law had gone to the countryside to relax in nature. What had happened was that a purpose in their lives, little understood by him, the old man, had come to light unexpectedly. What went through his young mind is unknown, but Austin bought an inexpensive log house in the neighboring village. Although, to be fair, the place was good. The house was near a river where you could swim, and there was an abundance of fish. The motive for this purchase was Austin's desire to leave the village for the countryside. He wanted, you see, to settle far away from human eyes and civilization. What was wrong with his parents' house in a village like that? It's hard to explain. Today's young people sometimes do crazy things, and they don't know why. Mason then decided not to argue with his son. Let him do what he wanted. After all, it was their money. As long as they remained in a normal relationship with the young. Austin also beautifully fantasized that he dreamed of adding more romance to a personal relationship. He wanted to please his beautiful wife, imagined how great it would be to spend time at the new house, a river nearby, a forest and fresh air, and wine and barbecue by the burning fire. What else does a modern man need for recreation? Austin loved his wife and could be proud of her. The girl was really beautiful. All the men looked at him when he walked with his wife through the village. Not a single guy's jaw dropped. They envied Austin. Some even tried to approach Katie with flirtatious proposals, but were turned away. She was a complicated girl with her own notions. Anyway, they bought the house after all. But Austin's plan to have a wonderful life in her family's nest was not fated to come true. Fate made adjustments. One day near the evening, my parents got the news of a terrible event. For unknown reasons, a terrible fire broke out in their new Austin house. Within minutes, the wooden structure burst into flames like a torch. At any rate, that's what the forensic experts who examined the scene said. The experts said that the bodies of the dead could not be found and it was not clear where they had gone. Some miraculously undamaged objects were found on the ashes, presumably personal belongings of the deceased, such as a buckle of a man's belt, a half-melted lock of a woman's purse, and some other small things. Forensic experts expressed the opinion that such a strong fire was not without flammable substances. The real cause of the arson, and most importantly, its perpetrator, could not be found. Be that as it may, the investigation went no further. At this point, that was it. All the searches came to a dead end. Eventually, the case was closed for lack of evidence. It is hard to say why the investigation was so negligent. Maybe there was no order to dig deep into the case from above, or maybe the investigator was inexperienced, or for some other reason. At first, it was hard for them to get used to the loss of two close people, but over time Mason came to terms with the death of his son and decided to live for the sake of his beloved grandson. Unfortunately, Austin's adoptive mother, Amanda, was not able to survive this tragedy. Maybe the emotional turmoil from the nightmare she experienced was the cause of her death. For the long-awaited trip to the sea, Mason raised money from his small pension. It lasted for several years until he had saved up the amount he needed for the trip. Of course, he could have raised the money earlier, but somehow it didn't work out. He had to buy groceries, or he had to pull on his grandson's outerwear and piggy banks. Finally, a couple of days ago, the man bought 2 train tickets and began packing his bags for the long journey. On the day of the trip, they left the house early and went to the bus stop in the center of the village. An old bus pulled up, and soon they were on their way, jolting in the second-class carriage, gazing with pleasure at the dusty landscapes of summer, forests, rivers, villages, and animals grazing in the fields. Mason eventually became bored with this kaleidoscope of events and went out into the vestibule for a quiet smoke. And Max climbed on the top shelf, opened the window a little, and continued to admire the nature. Several times the boy approached the conductor and asked when the sea would finally appear. The conductor replied with a smile that if everything went according to plan, at the end of next year, the train would certainly reach the sea coast. He was joking, of course, but Max took his jokes at face value and sincerely regretted that it would not happen soon. Mason heard his grandson complaining about the slow-moving train and smiled and tried to explain to the boy that his uncle the conductor was joking and that they would arrive much sooner. After that calmed-down Max climbed back on the top shelf and continued to observe the scenery and landscapes flashing through the window, while the old man strolled around the carriage, found some like-minded man, just like him, and sat down with him for a long time to play chess. Time flew by, and in a couple of days the train was slowly approaching its destination. The travelers were met by a beautiful snow-white station and a resort town with exotic trees that grandfather and grandson had only seen on TV before. The town was big. The hotel was expensive for an old man's budget, and Mason was even worried at first that they would have to live on the street, but it turned out to be no big deal. Locals advised them to look for lodging in the private sector, where prices were cheaper and furnishings were simpler. They were lucky enough to find a small house on the edge of town where they rented a room for a reasonable price. The landlady was of a very venerable age and did not seek riches, contenting herself with very little. Immediately after paying for the room, the travelers unpacked their suitcases, took their swimming trunks and towels, and by evening they headed for the long-awaited sea. It was very close. Max's expectations came true. The grandfather and grandson stood hand in hand and admired the vast sea stretching to the horizon. It was not pure black, but rather greenish, with a slight touch of blue ultramarine. The atmosphere around me was filled with the mingled smell of sea spray, fresh wind, and something else that was elusive and unusual. Perhaps it was the smell of iodine, of which not every vacationer had heard. Only for seasoned visitors to the seashore, it was difficult to confuse the scent with anything else. That was the smell of green seaweed, thrown out by the waves and decaying in huge quantities on the rocky shore in the hot sun. The foamy waves shattered into tiny splashes on the huge boulders covered in green moss. The air shuddered with these blows, and the sounds turned into a continuous rumble. There was also loud laughter and squealing. This was happening near the shore, where jubilant children were jumping, swimming, laughing, and trying to resist the blows of the waves. The shore was studded with round pebbles, polished to a matte sheen by the waves. The beach had been landscaped by the local authorities. Here and there stood colorful cabins for changing clothes, and we could see some stairs, metal stairs, and wooden umbrellas. The area was crowded with people, women, men, children, and the elderly. Some of them were lazily turning over in the sunlight, evenly browned. Others were greedily gulping down icy water from big plastic bottles. Others had just got out of the sea and were laying on hot rocks, drenched in sweat mixed with salty sea water. "Grandpa, I'm going for a swim," shouted Max impatiently, throwing off his shorts and t-shirt. "Go, but be careful to swim near the shore, or I will not let you go again. And remember where we're sitting so you don't get lost. I'll wait for you here." Max ran off to swim, and Mason took a bench in the shade under the mushroom and began to slowly undress, constantly watching his grandson. Then he was distracted by an older, overweight woman who was trying to get a seat next door, and Mason lost sight of Max for a while. The woman was bored by herself and tried to engage her neighbor in conversation so that she could scratch her tongue. The old man was a sociable man, and he kept up the conversation for a while for the sake of decorum. Then suddenly it seemed to him that the boy had disappeared. He jumped up and started intensely looking for Max in the crowd of bathing kids, but his grandson was nowhere to be found, and he got very excited. Suddenly someone's cold, wet hand touched his arm. He looked around. Max was standing beside him, agitated and frightened. "Grandpa, I just saw Mom and Dad. They were sitting at a table in a cafe." Mason paled at this wild phrase and tried to smile. "What are you talking about, Max? You must have them mixed up with someone else." "You can't be. They've been dead for 5 years. Come sit with me in the shade. Maybe you've got a headache." But the boy wouldn't let up. "Grandpa, I saw them up close. It must have been them." "Let's go see them now. It's close by. They're sitting in the cafe." Mason gave up. "Well, all right. Now we'll go over there and see who you saw." The old man was almost certain that the parents Max had seen were a figment of his hallucinations or some strange resemblance, but to be sure, he had to prove to his grandson that he was imagining things. It didn't work that way, though somewhere in the back of his mind, his inner voice whispered that the people his grandson saw were not figments of his imagination and were real. Mason sensed there must be some mystery behind it. In the end, he decided that the best way to be sure was to see the twins with his own eyes. The grandfather and his grandson hurriedly packed up and headed deep into the beach to the cafe called Brigantine. They stealthily approached from the side of the juniper bushes growing along the fence. At one of the tables in the striped awning, a couple was sitting quietly on the platform, and the sight of them made the hair on the old man's head flutter. It was indeed his son Austin and daughter-in-law Katie. There was no doubt. It was them. Mason tried to pull himself together and think calmly about the situation. He had never encountered the living dead and had never even heard how to behave in such cases. And meanwhile, Max's parents were sitting quietly at the table and were discussing drinks and dishes from the menu as if nothing had happened. The couple then decided to order 2 servings of creamy ice cream, French champagne, kebabs and crab salad. It was evident that the deceased were feeling fine, and the connections to the afterlife did not prevent them from passing on earthly pleasures. Mason decided not to reveal his cards, but to quietly see where they went next. After a hearty dinner at the cafe, the deceased relatives walked toward town. It was not a long walk. The son and daughter-in-law's journey ended behind the metal-patterned gates of a luxurious 2-story mansion in an elite area of the city. The people who lived there were rich. Luxurious houses that looked like palaces of movie stars, foreign cars of popular brands, and the inhabitants dressed according to the latest fashion made it clear that the people living here had no problems with money. "That's how it is," thought the stunned retiree. But where did Austin get the money to buy such a palace? No job, even the best-paid one, would have saved that much money even in 50 years. There's clearly a criminal element here, or what was this or he himself could not explain. It did not even occur to him. What connection with his dead relatives, and to whom these strange actors played an incomprehensible show. Mason himself didn't believe in mysticism, though there had been some precedents for seeing it in his life. For example, there was a witch in the village who could cure sciatica in the elderly and who could conjure abortions in the young. But her treatment was often a hoax. At one time, grandmother even wanted to beat for her scams, but on a broom she did not fly at night, with the devil force did not associate, and even a black cat in her house was not, so the reason for her beating by deceived villagers was not found. But the phenomenon faced by the old man required a rigorous scientific approach. When the pensioner had more questions than answers, Mason had the idea to call the police just in case. He wished they could take this mysterious couple under their white hands and make them talk at the police station. He strongly doubted that they were his missing relatives, and all sorts of bad thoughts crossed his mind. 15 minutes after his call, A police car rolled up to the address and law enforcement officers persistently knocked on the gate of the mansion. To the great indignation of the police officers, the owner of the house flatly refused to talk to them and rudely barked from the second floor that it was a private property and he had no intention of letting the police into the house. After an act of civil disobedience, a second SWAT team arrived on the scene, dealing with the most unforeseen and dangerous situations in the city and the neighborhood. They jumped out of the group, loaded, tough-looking guys in black uniforms, broke the gate and the oak door with special equipment, and stormed into the luxurious building. The owner of the house tried to draw his pistol from its holster, but he had no time. They quickly disarmed him and threw him nonchalantly face down on the marble floor. After that, the aggressive Superman immediately fell silent, realizing that he had understood everything and was no longer trying to resist, knowing that his pretty face would be ruined for the rest of his life. The resurrected Austin was handcuffed behind his back, his hands clasped in the air, and he was carefully escorted to a squad car with solid bars. Already at the station, under the sights of numerous video cameras, the detainee decided to confess. Of course, this was not the result of his inner decision to honestly repent and take the path of reform. Moreover, he did not even think about it. He considered such actions a sign of weakness. He was simply talked to by the investigator in a cordial manner before the interrogation and told him how many years he would get if he refused to help the investigation. He was looking at a long sentence, so Austin decided not to resist. The information obtained from him was very interesting for the people somehow connected with the case. As it turned out, the detained owner of a multi-million-dollar seaside mansion was a twin brother of Dmitri, the adopted son. When Mason adopted Austin, the director of the orphanage went for a trick to give the foster parents one of the twins. He chose not to tell about the other. Many childless families at that difficult time were reluctant to adopt two children at once for obvious financial reasons. The arguments were ironclad. It was difficult to support two children financially. The salary did not allow. The neighbors would not approve. The wife would not want to bother, and so on. But when the director suggested taking at least one twin out of the two, there were diametrically different circumstances. No one wanted to take the sin on their soul and separate the brothers. Having listened to excuses, the director of the orphanage himself became the separator, although he did it for good reasons, to help the twin orphans find a family. Except that, despite his tricks, one of the brothers was lucky and the other was not. Austin was adopted, but his twin brother Jake was not. There were no volunteers after graduating from the orphanage. The second brother didn't want to work honestly in a factory or a pasta factory. He believed that it was unprofitable to work for the state, and so he preferred to join the underworld, where it was richer and more well-to-do. His gangster career began in one of the dangerous gangs, where he got a job as a petty performer. Then, cunning and devoid of morals, the youngster gained confidence in the leader of the gang. Cheeky Jake rolled around like a cheese in butter. In his inner circle, when the time came, he faked the murder of his patron without any remorse in order to take his place himself. Jake knew in his heart that there should be no misfires in such an undertaking. Any mistake could cost him his life, and his future career could be forgotten forever. Throughout his life, he had read many detectives, studying and mastering complex schemes of crime, reading special books on psychology, acting and criminology, cramming strategy and tactics of the crime. Thanks to this knowledge, he was able to plan the murder of the ringleader Almaz with pinpoint accuracy. For a start, he learned all the tastes and habits of the chief, studied when and with whom he spent his day, so as not to run into any surprises. He'd never been a phony. Diligent, he took a business-like approach to achieving his goal. At first, Jake had the idea of poisoning the boss, but as a man of common sense, he thought and resolutely refused that method, concluding that they would start checking all the people in the boss's inner circle. Then he had the idea of setting up a car crash for the boss to disable the brakes, for example, or to arrange some other malfunction in the chassis. But he did not like this idea either. It was too risky venture, and he did not want to take any risks. Based on the knowledge he had acquired and the in-depth analytical work he had done, Jake chose the best possible way to eliminate Diamond. He decided to bet on the boss's Achilles heel, to try to enter from his weak side, and that spot was found. Diamond loved soccer and never missed a tournament. To carry out his plan, Jake chose a time when he would come to the city stadium to cheer on his favorite soccer team. Especially for that day, Jake acquired a powerful explosive device with a clockwork mechanism in a nearby town through fictitious persons. An hour before Alma's arrived, he went into his boss's private box and planted a magnetic mine under the hors d'oeuvres table. The table was covered with a long tablecloth that reached all the way to the ground. In addition, as Jake found out beforehand, no one had checked the box. Diamond, cool though he was a simple man, with no background, blindly trusting his surroundings. And this ruined him. The attack was prepared cleanly, so no one suspected a thing. At the right time, the charge exploded, leaving not even a trace of Diamond. No one in the gang suspected Jake that day, as everyone was sure of his loyalty to Olnas, who called him his right-hand man. On top of that, he had an ironclad alibi. He was in a hotel outside of town at the time. The bandits could not even think of such unheard-of perfidy, and for some reason decided that the murder was the work of rivals from another group. This decision was to Jake's advantage and diverted suspicion from him. It was decided to retaliate violently for Diamond. For this reason, the next day a real criminal vendetta broke out in the city. The bandits killed the ringleaders, their cronies from other gangs, ruthlessly eliminating everyone in all places. The police were powerless in the face of a flood of murders. There was criminal chaos. Crimes simply couldn't be solved in time. Once all the authorities and their cronies had been killed, the war slowly began to subside. After the armistice, the gang's agenda was to change their leader. Thanks to his criminal knowledge, Jake was well respected by the gangsters, and at the General Council he was chosen as their leader. For several years he personally led the gang, carefully selecting the most seasoned criminals for future work. By personal criteria, he chose those who would not let him down, and at his order would do any dirty work, as ruthless as he himself. Then, with 5 accomplices, the bandit began to travel around the country in search of thieves to earn money. The work turned out to be plentiful. They came to the cities, contacted the local punk, tipsters, and for a fee learned from them addresses of local rich men. Gradually, Jake grew bolder and became a dangerous burglar, committing the most unexpected and daring robberies of rich houses, not shy of torturing his victims. The rich men were afraid to give him the keys to the safes after only a few minutes with his dashing gentleman of fortune. People were afraid to complain about the bandit because the criminals immediately warned of serious consequences for them and their families. There were bad rumors about Jake and his gang all over the country. It was said that those who did not want to share their wealth were found maimed and tied in the deep woods, but most often these people disappeared without a trace. The bandit was unlucky in love. Jake had no steady women, despite the fact that he was attractive as a man. Tall, slender, with broad shoulders and an intrepid look of steel-grey eyes. He had the look of a warrior winner who would throw into his arms any, even the most unapproachable girl. Women went crazy for him, but his heart remained lonely for a long time because he did not see among them pretenders worthy of his specialty. This was not idle bravado or the megalomania of a dangerous madman. He really did treat mistresses as a bargaining chip. Jake did not believe and believed that a woman was capable of betrayal at any minute. Ironically, Jake's heroic appearance went to a scoundrel. He successfully used his external data, easily entered into the trust of people, using the books he had studied on acting. He often smiled, even when he was robbing and killing. That cheeky smile became his trademark in the files of the criminal investigators. Jake was nicknamed Jolly in the Zone. He had several serious crimes hanging over him, and over time he became elusive and was constantly on the wanted list. At one time he even considered having plastic surgery to get rid of the surveillance and start a new life from scratch, but did not have time. He was arrested for resisting the police during detention and accidentally untwisted on several old cases. Fortunately for Jake, the investigator was unable to uncover most of his crimes, so he was not given a very long sentence. The second brother, Austin, was brought up by his foster parents under the supervision of Mason and his wife. From an early age, they tried to teach the boy human values to protect the weak, to work diligently, not to be greedy, to tell the truth and live in peace with other people. And they achieved their goal. The proper upbringing and vigilant attention of the foster parents bore fruit. Austin grew up to be a real man. The boy was always distinguished by something good from childhood. He learned to read early, when he was only 5. Until he mastered the art of reading, he often asked his mother, "Mammy, please read some more." "Oh, Austin, I can't take it anymore. I'm exhausted." "Oh, God." Amanda faintly complained, but she could not resist a child's longing for the light of knowledge. And she read about Masha and the 3 bears, about the Snow Queen and the cold-blooded Kay, and Gerda who loves him. "Mom, don't sleep." What were the bears doing when Masha left them? Austin adored dogs and cats. Not a single owner of paws, whiskers and tail he did not miss, dragged home everyone he could. Sometimes it was cheerful puppies, other times it was fluffy little kittens. Each of them could count on a place in the hospitable Austin heart. Once inside, the tailed aliens immediately marked the territory with tiny puddles and smelly piles of weightier arguments. Amanda, for the sake of her son, put up with everything for the first time. Of course, she cleaned diligently, scrubbed the floors with bleach, and set up sandboxes for the cats. When her patience ran out, she would act out the animal's escape by quietly giving him to some kind hands. Austin would run home after school and be surprised to find that his beloved pet had disappeared. "Mommy, where did the cat go?" he would ask indignantly. "I do not know," even made innocent eyes Amanda. In the morning, he was near the radiator. "I poured milk into a saucer for him today. What happened? Did he disappear?" "Gone," Austin lamented, hardly moving a mop under the sofa and the cupboards. He naively assumed that the kitten was hiding somewhere. "Well, all right." Mom threw a relieved smile, furtively hiding her happy eyes. "The kitten escaped to the mother cat, and that's all right. You and I would rather read a book. I bought you a new fairy tale." Austin would go sad for a couple of days, but then he brought home the next pet, and everything started over again. In the end, the cycle of animals in nature ended with a compromise between my son and my mother. She bought him a budgie, which lived in a cage, and therefore could not get out and mark their territory. The bird calmed the child down a bit, and he got much quieter. Mom also calmed down, and then Austin developed other interests. He got into sports. He signed up for soccer. Then he liked volleyball, then table tennis. After that, the guy fell in love with other sports available in their small village. There was a small library in the village, and the boy signed up there, having read almost all the books in a year. They were no longer children's stories. Once Jake, as a repeat offender, was serving time in a maximum security penal colony for a crime he had committed. Vasily tried to behave decently in the penal colony, not to be seen by his superiors and to get out quickly. Conditions and food in the colony were severely restricted, but the recidivist got away with it. If he needed any food, he used the help of the ensign he had bribed from the guards. He gave him large sums of money, and he brought in whatever he wanted: bacon, butter, tea, sausage, gingerbread and candy. He got triple the price of vodka and some forbidden stuff, even though it was really forbidden. The convicts drank at night so as not to be noticed by the snitches, which were always plentiful in the zone. Jake and his crew went out secretly. They only once caught a drunken felon drunk, but Jake arranged it for money so the case wouldn't go through, and the snitch was found dead in a garbage can a week later. During his time in prison, Jake never got caught. He was made foreman and could now count on getting out of the zone for a long time. Jake's plan was successful. He was released before his legal sentence, and after his release, Jake drove to the district center to take a walk and rest after his time in prison. Walking through the local market, he came face to face with his own brother and his wife. The encounter shook all three of them. The two twins stared at each other's faces for a long time, trying to figure out why there was such a resemblance between them. Gradually they understood everything and recognized each other. There could be no doubt. True, Jake looked more masculine and muscular than Austin. In prison, he was active in sports. A lot of inmates do it. Sports are a popular pastime among inmates for a number of reasons, and they are different for each convict. First, those who play sports for health really believe that athletes are more viable people in the conditions of the zone. Many dangerous diseases are common behind barbed wire. Sports help boost the immune system and allow the athlete to survive. AIDS and tuberculosis, syphilis, and viral hepatitis are common in the zone. To avoid them, it is better to be on the sports field than to communicate with those who can infect. And anyone could infect. Even people with TB would deliberately do it, leaving unsmoked cigarettes for fellow sufferers. They were pissed off that they didn't have long to live when the others were released. Secondly, physically strong criminals, when released, were quicker to achieve their criminal goals. If you have well-pumped arms and legs, you can easily outrun a police patrol or flee the scene of the crime, fighting back against law enforcement officers. Thirdly, pumped-up sex, despite their black past, are liked by women who are not particularly demanding of their beau. This effect is secretly counted on by every convict, who hopes to eventually be released and start a family. There are even special people in prison, usually with literary talent, who write love letters to women from the outside for a modest fee. Such a letter does not cost too much: a pack of cigarettes, tea, or a piece of bacon. The customers, people, as a rule illiterate, are familiar only with a thief's lockpick or trowel, which in his civilized life stacked bricks on the construction site. Literate performers of love correspondence are valued and cherished in the zone. The final result of an extramural love affair depends on them. If you don't spare a cigarette or sausage for a writer, then after release you'll get an invitation from some knave Rose or Jane from the provincial outback. And if you're greedy, you won't get anything. That's why criminals try to feed the literate man, treat him as much as possible, share the contents of his parcel, give him a candy bar or new socks or a lighter. Austin was the weaker of the brothers because he could not devote too much time to his physical development. The guy studied by correspondence and worked, which allowed him to support his family thinly or thinly. His wife, Katie, was a lovable and romantic woman who did not appreciate her hard-working and humble husband. She preferred strong and determined men, tattooed, tanned, muscular. The girl adored foreign films. They boiled and bubbled passion on the background of luxury villas, expensive cars, and tropical landscapes. Immediately after the wedding, Katie hated the measured, quiet life in the countryside, often cried at night, trying to do it without her husband's notice. She believed that her youth had been for nothing, and that nothing interesting awaited her in the future. When she saw Jake, she immediately fell in love with this handsome man, deciding that he was her ideal. She immediately turned pink and smiled at the unfamiliar man, while paying no attention to the reaction of her husband. Too much resentment piled up in her soul, and she was not going to go on living like that. After a prolonged pause, Austin held out his hand to Jake and smiled affectionately. "Hello, brother." Jake jokingly threw his right palm to his temple, covering the top of his head with his other hand, and said, "We don't shake hands with the first people we meet. That's the way it is." "Who do you have?" "Thieves who live by our ways." "You're a thief." "That's the way it is, old man." Alas, and a thief with experience. Jake's gaze slid impudently over Katie's slender figure, and she was only happy about it. "Well, let's sit in a cafe, brother," Austin suggested. "We'll have some ice cream and coffee. Aren't you gonna invite me home? I'd like to see how your parents are doing." "You know, we probably shouldn't do that, Jake. My foster dad's an old school guy. He's a hard worker. Worked his whole life in the country as a tractor driver. He's retired now. He wouldn't approve of this kind of acquaintance." Austin tried to hint transparently to Jake that acquaintance with a recidivist thief was not considered in their circle an event worthy of the attention of decent people. Jake grinned wryly. "Okay, don't worry, Austin, I'm not offended. Let's go to the cafe, have a man-to-man meeting, talk about life." At this point, he was 100% sure that Katie was in love with him. In love with him. Her rosy face and enthusiastic eyes were an eloquent indication of this. Jake had often encountered this kind of attention from the opposite sex, so he knew exactly what was going on in her soul. They went to the nearest cafe and took a table under a sprawling tree. The conversation at the table didn't stick. The twins were too different to find common ground quickly and reveal their real thoughts. Jake said straight away that he would pay for the table, and that he had no money problems. He snapped his fingers in a merchant's way and called for a waiter. "Man, bring us a bottle of champagne, free salads to your taste, kebabs, 300 vodka, free ice cream, and a chocolate dessert." He smiled charmingly at Katie, playing the gentleman. "Will you have any sweets?" "I will. Won't it ruin my figure?" "You've got a fine figure. Nothing will spoil it," said the outlaw with a certainty as he poured the vodka into the glasses. "Brother, you have a charming wife. I approve." "I like her too," said Austin dryly, beginning to notice with displeasure his brother's attention to his wife. After drinking the vodka, Austin got drunk quickly, tried to tell some joke, and suddenly fell headlong into a plate with a salad. He rarely drank, and such a dose was too much for him. "Well, that's it. Our Superman's finish." Jake smiled, putting his tanned hand firmly over Katie's palm. "He's really so undrinkable." "Well, yes, he really can't drink," she laughed. "That's good. Then we'll have time to have a serious talk." Katie flirtatiously fixed her hair and got ready to listen. Jake began a conversation that pleased her at first. The criminal admitted that he liked Katie at first sight, and that was true, but she didn't like his offer at all, because it reeked of the blackest of criminals. Jake offered to kill Austin, and after his death to stay with her until her old age. She was frightened at first and felt sorry for her husband, but the insidious seducer threatened to get up and leave immediately. So the maiden in love up to her neck spat on the voice of conscience. She heard only her own heart and was ready to go to any crazy deeds as long as Jake would stay close. The new acquaintances drank champagne and sealed their satanic pact right at the table with a strong and long kiss. Meanwhile, Austin, condemned to death by his own brother, was sleeping like a baby, face down in a crab salad. Jake called the waiter over and paid for his dinner, adding to his tip. Katie looked at the contents of his wallet and fell even more in love. She hoped that Jake would get her out of the dull village and take her to another beautiful magical world. The recidivist Mary seemed to her at that moment like the prince on a white horse that some women wait all their lives for. In fact, Jake had other far-reaching plans that he wasn't going to share with Katie. He was playing a double game that the girl was not yet aware of. After paying for dinner, Jake hailed a cab, laid Austin lightly on his back, and carried him into the pull-up car. Katie went with them. 10 minutes later, they were at the local hotel. In the swanky room, Jake and Katie put Austin to bed in a small room, and they went to another room, turned off the lights, and began kissing passionately. A night of pleasure awaited them, and they could take their time. Austin slept soundly in the other room as a baby's sleep. Katie ran to the bathroom, and Jake went out on the balcony and smoked. Below him lay the resort town, all lit up, and it belonged to him. He felt like a master of life because he had money flowing to him in an endless stream. In the morning, Austin awoke in an unfamiliar bed to sunlight streaming in through the expensive plastic blinds. It was 10 o'clock. Somewhere outside the window the city rumbled, his head ached, and he didn't want to live. The TV set was on in the next room, and male and female voices from a soap opera could be heard. The boy struggled to get up and staggered out of the bedroom. Jake and Katie sat on the leather couch at a pioneer distance and pretended to keep their eyes on the TV. "Katie, how did we get here?" "My head hurts," Austin groaned. "And I don't remember much." "You met Jake at the market yesterday," Katie explained, "and we decided to celebrate your meeting at the cafe." "Don't worry, old man," Jake grinned. "It's the kind of thing you see with people who don't drink. You didn't have much to drink, 100 grams at most, but you slept like an elephant all night." "Where did Katie sleep?" Austin asked suspiciously. "By your side," Jake reassured him. "I slept in this room on the couch. You wouldn't happen to have any cold soda, would you? I'm thirsty." "I got it, bro. You can get a bottle in the fridge. We'll have breakfast, and then you and I can talk about something important." During breakfast, Jake briefly explained to his brother the situation he was now in. He complained about how he had been released from prison, how he had lied about having nowhere to live, how he had no family, and how he couldn't afford to buy a place to live right away. He could at least live in a basement, like the last homeless person no one wanted. The bank did not want to give him a loan to buy a house as a former repeat offender. They demanded a deposit, which he did not have. Of course, he lied about the collateral. He could have given 10 such bail if he wanted to. Jake knew how to lie, and he did it diligently and often. Austin took pity on his brother, asked how he could help him. Jake, for the sake of appearance, kept silent, and then suddenly suggested that Austin buy a house near the river, a kind of summer cottage, where you can relax, swim, fish, and he, Jake, would guard the cottage and live in it. The ex-con promised to return the money for the house to his brother if possible, a year at the most. "Just think, Austin, what good will it do you?" Jake persuaded him. "The cottage won't cost you a penny. I'm buying it for myself. You know, I'm borrowing it from you. You pay the full amount now, and I'll give you the money in a year. And you still own the cottage. I'll give it to you. I'll just live there. You won't cheat me out of the house, will you? It's got to be fair between us. We're brothers. Well, make up your mind. We'll go fishing and hunting together. Courage, old man." Austin began to think. The offer really seemed profitable, and I would earn money for my dacha, and on the way I would help my brother. We were not strangers after all. He immediately began to think how to tell his father about this purchase. Suddenly, he thought of explaining that he was buying the house for himself, for country picnics of sorts, like for resting. And that's how it was decided. Austin's wife did not interfere in the conversation for some reason. She was suspiciously quiet and did not even argue about the choice of the cottage. She blamed it all on her husband. Jake immediately offered to register the house in his own name. He said it would be better for the IRS. They wouldn't have to pay for the registration and all the legal details involved in the paperwork. Austin didn't know much about all that official stuff, so he quickly agreed. He thought his brother was good at it and knew more about buying real estate than he did as a country boy. Jake could be proud of his resourcefulness. His brother suspected nothing. He agreed to give him the money to buy and even put the house in someone else's name. The recidivist Jake just didn't expect such success. In his cunning mind, a backdoor plan matured consisting of a string of benefits and advantages exclusive to himself. Jake was not in that plan. The criminal simply cut him out of his life. He wanted to seize his property and even steal his wife away from him. If they'd gotten it right, they'd have swapped places, and Austin, under his, Jake's, name, would simply go missing. He would want to reincarnate as Austin and live a new life under his name. That is, to throw the police off the trail and start fresh. As one would expect, Austin's parents did not object to the purchase, believing that he himself knew what he was doing. By an advertisement, Austin bought a house in a neighboring village near a river in a good location. The bill of sale was drawn up in the name of Vesely, who at a certain time drove up to the notary in the guise of Austin. From that moment on, the twin brother was of no use to the recidivist. He had achieved his goal, and now Austin's life hung in the balance. The bandit only had to pick a good day and take his brother out of the game, hiding all the ends in water after that. A few months later, Katie suddenly got cranky and demanded a romantic trip to their country house. They went there alone. They left Max at home, promising him they would take him on a picnic next time. In the meantime, Jake had already prepared everything according to his criminal scenario. To do this, he had insured the house with several companies and hid a couple of canisters of fuel in the basement. When the couple arrived, he greeted them with a covered meadow of vodka and good snacks. As soon as his brother got tipsy, Mary hit him over the head with a rolling pin and told Katie to get ready quickly and go outside. There was a car waiting for them behind the house. The outlaw then retrieved the prepared canisters from the basement, doused the floor and walls of the house, took the empty canisters outside, and threw a match through the broken window, leaving his brother to die among the burning walls. Then Jake got in his car and drove with Katie to the sea, but he was out of luck. They were seen by a neighbor's deaf and dumb preschool boy who tried to tell his parents on his fingers what he had seen. He was misunderstood for a long time till he went to school and learned to write. After that, he was able to explain in writing to the investigator who had set the house on fire. Jake and his accomplice were apprehended. He received a life sentence and she was given probation. A few months later, around noon, there was a knock on Masop's door. On the doorstep was Austin's son. He immediately guessed it wasn't Jake. He understood that they could not let the old convict out of the zone. And even if he escaped, he would never dare to come to his house. "Austin, is that you?" asked the old man in a trembling voice. "It's me, Papa." "My God, how on earth did you survive? Is it possible?" "As you can see, Father, it is possible. But I've been through a lot, God forbid." "So tell me, Austin. Wait, are you hungry?" "I won't say no. I'm off the road after all." "Wait, Father, where's Max? Is he all right?" "Yeah, don't worry. He's fine. He's at school now." Dad went into the kitchen to make some food, and Austin lay down on the couch to rest. He didn't look well. He was emaciated, and his face showed pale, wrinkled scars from the burns. Waiting for him to eat, Mason again began to question how he had gotten out of the fire. Austin tiredly covered his face with his palms, drank water, and with a shiver in his voice began his story. "I, Father, survived that day only by miracle. Jake hit me on the back of the head, and I lost consciousness right away. I woke up on the floor, and everything around me was on fire. The floor, the walls, the windows. I noticed a knob on a wooden hatch in the floor and decided to hide from the fire in the basement. I rolled down. I see there's some kind of brick niche in the foundation for the utility shelves, probably laid out. And there's an old bathtub with water in front of it. Apparently, the previous owners had put it there for cement mortar. So I jumped into that tub to get my clothes wet, so I wouldn't get burned. And then wet, climbed into that niche. With difficulty, I pulled the bathtub closer and hid behind it. And when the burning embers started to fall, they fell into the tub. At least it burned quickly. That's how I survived. Later, When there was a lot of smoke and not enough air in the basement, I jumped out of the niche, grabbed some iron stick, and dug a hole in the coals to get out. Everything around me was collapsing. Some of the embers fell on me, and I finally jumped out of the ashes. I felt my shirt on fire. It hurt like hell. I barely made it to the river. It was about 20 meters to the river, and I fell into the water. Swam in the river until the pain subsided. Then I saw an old boat without oars under the bank and decided to lie down and rest the burns on my back. I lost consciousness and did not notice how the boat was caught up by the current. In general, I was carried a few kilometers lower. I was picked up by an old man. He was a fisherman and his name was Connor. He had no family and lived alone near the river in a shack. He asked me who I was and where I was from. I couldn't tell him because I couldn't remember anything. My memory was gone. I couldn't even remember the names of many things. Maybe it was because Jake hit me hard on the head. Later the doctors told me that it was a temporary memory loss and I lived with it for several years. I helped the old man with his fishing, cleaned and salted fish with him, often went to the market and exchanged the taran for bread and groceries there. One time, I saw a program on TV in a store about Jake and Katie being held up in their mansion. As soon as I saw them, I remembered who I was and how I ended up on the river. Do you have a lot of burns on your body, son? A lot. Mostly on my back and a little on my face, but it's all healed now. Thank God the scars on my face are almost invisible. It was about time I jumped in the river. Well, I was saved in the basement by a niche and a bathtub with water. Mason listened to his son, and his soul burst into tears. He tried not to show his state of mind to Austin. He smiled pretendingly and showed with all his appearance that everything was all right. The boy has been through so much, the old man thought. Why should you worry? The main thing is that everything is all right. Now let him live and bring up his son. He imagined how happy Max would be to know that his own father would now always be with him. Mason went to the window and saw the painfully familiar courtyard and the gate, which someone was opening. It was his grandson coming back from school. He was carrying a small, fluffy kitten in his arms. Mason involuntarily remembered the little Austin, who also dragged home all the stray animals, and a slight smile appeared on his trembling lips. "Grandpa," came Austin's voice in the hallway. "Do you remember letting me bring home another kitten to replace the old one? You know, the one that ran away from us to his cat mother the other day." The old man sighed and reached for the floor cloth. The habits of the little pets also echoed the course of history, and Mason had a lot of fun ahead of him.